So I'm always learning, including this morning, trying to figure out this little device. So the time of the involvement with these kinds of cases has given me what I think is a rare insight to the human psyche, which is, let's wait until something happens before we decide to do anything. And once you get through this presentation, you're going to understand why that may be a bad idea. We have litigated these issues in front of juries who basically take the position, show me something that somebody did wrong, show me something that somebody didn't act upon, and I'll think about granting you relief. And usually they do it with money because you can't bring back a dead person. In any event, I want to take you through what I call the 4 California killers. The one in the upper left is unreinforced masonry structures like the ones we had in Paso Robles and in San Luis Obispo. In the 2003 San Simeon earthquake, it collapsed and killed 2 young ladies and injured many others. Then the other killer that's more famous is the soft story killers, also known in the old days as tuck under parking. A bunch of architects and city officials decided that, you know, we ought to be able to utilize some portion of that building for parking, because parking, believe it or not, in this city is very significant. So they decided to do this tuck under parking system. And nobody thought about putting in a welded steel moment frame, so there was going to be some problems. Everybody knew about them since 1971, when Mr. Yanev out of Berkeley wrote a famous treatise saying these buildings will collapse, which they did, because and everyone knows what happened in the Northridge Meadows earthquake. And we were counsel, we were lead counsel on the Northridge Meadows collapse litigation, where 16 did die and many more were injured. And then there's welded steel moment frames. And welded steel moment frames were supposedly, I guess, broadcast as the safest structures in the state for an earthquake zone. In those days we had earthquake zone. We were 4. The most severe earthquake levels were LA, San Francisco, San Diego, the coastal areas. And they run all the way up to the northern part of the United States and down to Mexico. But it turns out that for a variety of reasons, including the use of non-ductile weld wire, that these strong, supposedly ductile steel beam to steel column structures failed during the Northridge earthquake, and that spawned a whole series of mandatory inspection ordinances within the city of Los Angeles and other municipalities. And we're going to get to that in a minute. The fourth area is non-ductile concrete, which is not reinforced. And I don't have time to get into the tilt-tips, so that'll have to wait for a different day. Okay, so here we go. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, here we go. I want to just brief you a little bit about the San Simeon earthquake. It's what we call a design-level earthquake. It's within a design expectation for a structural engineer, a civil engineer, and architect. It occurred near Christmas, December 22, 2003. It was a very interesting case because the Acorn building had been up and functional since, believe it or not, 1892. It was remodeled in 1980, and it was destroyed totally in 2003. And there you see it. It's kind of the landmark, or was the landmark, of Paso Robles. And one of the significant things about URMs that most people know by now, thanks to publications like the LA Times and San Francisco and San Diego publications, unreinforced masonry buildings don't really have a roof connection. They sit on a ledger, and you can see the ledger here. You can see the ledger here, where you can see the wood truss is sitting on a block. And the block, the wall is made out of bricks. So during the earthquake, with some lateral load, some horizontal movement, the roof will literally fall off that little ledger because it's not secured. And of course, the roof collapses, and whoever's within the building is staying there at their own risk. So a variety of things have happened with the governmental entities. California, believe it or not, notwithstanding all the criticism, has actually passed some significant laws to warn the general public about how these buildings will perform in a seismic event. So they enacted Health and Safety Code, Section 19161. Each city and county may assess the earthquake hazard and identify buildings as being potentially hazardous. And then one of them, number one target, was URMs, unreinforced masonry buildings. And then the second one that was identified was wood frame multi-unit residential buildings, what we call soft stories. So since that period of time, there has been a red flag dropped in front of all owners of these buildings telling them, you know what, you have a URM and a soft story building that's unreinforced, that is a hazardous building that we have defined within this code section, 19161. So what happened in San Simeon was the owners had received that notice from the government and from the state of California saying something to the effect of, we're not trying to congratulate you, we're not trying to scare you, but we need you to know that you are the owners, proud owners or not, of a hazardous building that will likely collapse within a design level earthquake in the foreseeable future. So how do you feel when you're an owner and you get that notice? Well, you got to do something about it. You at least have to, hire an architect or an engineer to look at it and see, is there a problem with me continuing to use this for business purpose or for habitation or occupation? Okay, so we don't need to get into the trial to find out what happened, because here's what happened before the structure could be retrofitted. In 2003, it went through these stages of collapse. You can see how the buildings are literally made up of unreinforced brick, and the brick is starting to crumble and it's starting to explode out like this. This is a reconstruction of what actually happened. And then the famous clock tower falls. And now we're giving you a view of the roof trusses that just simply lift off the brick ledgers because they're not connected, and they collapse. And when they collapse, they take the life of Jennifer Myrick and Marilyn Safuto. So those were 2 deaths, and there were injuries and property damage claims. And the real issue became, unfortunately, not the death of these 2 young ladies. It became, were the owners justified in waiting the time that they did to perform the repairs? So I want to give you an interesting fact for the defense, which was the city of Paso Robles, under pressure, if you can imagine that, from building owners, had continued the enforcement of their mandatory retrofit ordinance to, are you ready for this? 2018, to this year. The initial ordinance for mandatory retrofit was enacted, so there was a 2001 time frame for them to act. But that got continued and continued and continued. So the defense, the primary defense of the owner, that went up to the Court of Appeal and to the California Supreme Court for review, and the California Supreme Court looked at Justice Gilbert's appellate review and said, we're affirming this. No review for the California Supreme Court. So the decision of Justice Gilbert stood, and his decision is one of the most interesting ones you'll read, because it simply says, when you're a building owner, you've been notified that you're the owner of a dangerous or hazardous structure, and an earthquake strikes before the ordinance expires, you're playing Russian roulette. The California legislature enacted these laws, according to Justice Gilbert, not for the benefit of the owners, but for the benefit of the inhabiting public, to protect the public and general welfare. And we'll get to that in a little bit. In any event, it was quite a mess in San Luis Obispo and Paso Robles for a while. These are some of the clients that were reported in the media. And so I'm going to get back to the URMs in a broader sense. I'm going to show you how the laws apply to not just URMs, but how California law and jury instructions apply to not only URMs, but to soft story structures. So I have published a few articles. I guess the one that has made the most press is the one with the welded steel moment frames, and the other one is soft story structures, which we say in law establish negligence per se. If a governmental entity says your building is dangerous, we can show that to the jury. So here's what happened here in this city at Northridge Meadows in 1994, a 6.7 earthquake, and what you're looking at is the remnants of a 3-story structure. Of course, you're only seeing 2 stories because the 3rd story collapsed, the bottom story collapsed. So these are photographs that I took in 1994, and I'm in some of these photographs wearing a hard hat. We actually went to the Superior Court and got an injunction against the city of Los Angeles, who had the bulldozers out to demolish it. And we had a lot of folks out there, besides lawyers. We had professors from the universities, we had fire department, we had LA Police Department, we had search and rescue folks, but we really saved all the critical parts, the sill plates where they connected to the shear walls and stuff that we used to prosecute our case. But in the meantime, we've compiled thousands of photographs and hundreds of hours, well, dozens of hours of video for the Northridge Meadows that we now have in archives. So you're looking at some of the photos, and of course the DB means or signifies dead bodies. So what you're looking at is the aftermath, and a lot of people have never seen these photos, but we like to remind people that this is not a one and done situation. What we're looking at here is considered a moderate earthquake by today's standards, and we're still waiting for one that's going to be much larger, more intense, and it's going to last longer. So if you read about the Alaska earthquake, one of the remarkable things about that earthquake was it lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. So think about the Northridge Meadow lasting 2 minutes and 45 seconds. I mean, you would not be able to handle that. I wouldn't be able to handle that. So these are the rest of the photos, and the repair for the soft story structure is to put in a welded steel moment frame on the soft story structure. So you can see the grade beams below where the red arrows are shown, and you can see the backhoe, the mini backhoe digging a trench to put in a grade beam. And then you're going to have structural posts and structural beams at the top, and that's going to act as a shear wall. And because they're steel moment frames, you're still going to be able to utilize it as tuck under parking. Now, is that expensive? Well, you'll have to read the media and talk to the contractors to find out, but it is expensive. If you think $100,000 to $200,000 to retrofit your structure is expensive, but then you have to evaluate that against what will happen in an earthquake if a life is taken or the structure is lost. I'm reminded that the standard analysis for the aftermath of an earthquake can be summarized as death, damage, and downtime. Death, damage, and downtime. And you and I probably think death and damage are the most significant. I think the building owners that I've talked to are really more concerned with the downtime. And is my structure going to be down a couple of months or a couple of years? The answer is after an earthquake, when you can't hire a contractor or an architect or an engineer, it's going to take over 2 years. Okay, so California has enacted a mandatory retrofit program in some of the cities. Los Angeles, Berkeley, other areas in San Francisco. But by the way, I'm not saying Berkeley's in San Francisco, it's not. It's across the bay. And Santa Monica have mandatory retrofit programs. The funniest thing was that when I went to Berkeley, because I hired some of the engineers there as consultants, I was shocked that everyone in Berkeley knew that there were numerous soft story structures, and they had reported them. The engineering department at Berkeley had reported them to the city council over and over again, just like the engineers and the building department in LA had reported it to the mayor and to the government. Nobody wanted to publish. So the engineering department in Berkeley published this map, and it made its way into the media. What a shock. So here's the engineering department saying, hey, these are unsafe buildings. They're hazardous buildings. Somebody needs to fix them. I mean, you know, we're tired of yelling about it. Peter Yanev did this study in 1971, the original study. So they were tired of it. Okay, so the media has a role. You know, it's education, and it can cause individuals to act, whether they're government officials or structural engineers or just an ordinary homeowner. So that's what was done in Berkeley. Santa Monica has recently published this map this year. Okay, so the idea about let's sweep all the bad stuff under the carpet, that is no longer an option. The cities, the press is now publishing locations of hazardous buildings. And this is just Santa Monica. So somebody needs to do a lot of work here. And here's my favorite, not because it's San Francisco, but because it's published in the New York Times. So it took the New York Times across the coast to publish the location of all the hazardous buildings that exist today in one of our favorite cities, of course, San Francisco. And then they take you back to the 1906 7.9 earthquake, April 18, we all know that. The significance is not that it occurred in 1906. The significance is we are expecting that earthquake to come back any day now. USGS has had San Francisco on red alert for the last decade. So that's what we expect. I doubt if you'll see this kind of destruction because, quote, the buildings are supposedly better constructed these days. All right, and so I'll leave that for you guys to evaluate. The most interesting question we get is, well, if I'm a building owner, how do I know my building is unsafe? You know, say the government sends me a notice, you may have, or you have a potentially hazardous building. How do I know? And so the question arises, what is public knowledge? You know, when do you as an owner know that all the newspapers and all the publications have said this is a dangerous structure? So you can see the east-west and the northwest shear walls, and these are welded steel moment frame structures, and they resist the shear in the east-west, north-south direction, as well as rotation, torsion, and the rest of the seismic forces. Here's the problem. And you notice I've touched on URMs, I've touched on soft story structures, and now I'm getting to welded steel moment frames. Literally, the beam is welded or glued to the column. And when you see these in person, you're really shocked because there's no ledger, there's nothing. There's just a smooth surface on the column, and then the little screw thing, that's called the shear tab. That's just to hold it in place while the structural connection, which is the welding, the weld wire is installed. And in the old days, they used to use stick weld wire called E7018, and it kind of looked like long firework sticks. And the welders would get it, and they'd put in a row called a pass, and they'd go the other way, put in a pass, and they'd use their steel brush and wipe off all the occlusions, and then start again until they had, 10 or 15 passes. Well, because of modern technology, we now have the welders that can apply the wire with a welding gun. So these big rolls of weld wire. But all the goodies are inside the tube, the weld wire tube. In order to make the weld wire flexible to go through a gun, they had to add additional aluminum. And when you're talking about a ductile weld wire, aluminum appears to be chemically the kiss of death because instead of getting ductility, you get a brittle connection. So during an earthquake, all the loads would go to the connection between the beam and the column, which was supposed to be the strongest connection because the weld wire was supposed to be stronger than the base metal. Well, it wasn't, and it fractured below and it fractured above. And when we published those results in cosmetically repaired welded steel moment frames in 1996, the community changed its thinking, not because of anything I did. I mean, I talked to the big guys. I talked to Popov, the guy that invented this connection to Berkeley. I sent my paper to 100 structural engineers and 50 architects for comment. It took 6 months to publish that thing. So bottom line is, we have a problem. Second bottom line is the city of Los Angeles passed an ordinance in 1996 after the publication of the paper saying, okay, every owner of a welded steel moment frame building has to inspect. So they got notices. You have to inspect. You have to give us the results. You have to use the SAC approach, okay? In any event, before the ordinance was 3 months old, for whatever reason, the city council exempted the downtown Los Angeles area from that mandatory ordinance, where all the high-rises live. So that was kind of an interesting thing. The more interesting thing, 20 plus years later, is that we still don't have a response from building owners who are under mandatory ordinance to inspect and report. So these mandatory ordinances you see coming out today, they are mandatory retrofit. You're beyond the time where you can actually go out and inspect. You actually have to retrofit and perform a repair. So hopefully that'll be a little more successful, but time will tell. So these are some of the fractures you see in the beam to column connections. And we used to take the whole section and send it to a lab. It's very costly, about $20,000 to $25,000 per connection. You have to shore the building, you have to put a substitute, and then you have to do these polished cross sections. And you can see on this cross section that we've traced the actual location of the inception of the fracture, and you can see that light gray area, which is the heat affected zone. So everybody knows about these. They've been reported in mainstream media, coast to coast. So at the EERI seminar, somebody said, well, we're engineers, how do we know, when we've crossed the line and we haven't done something we're required to do? And one of my co-panelists, before I could answer that question, stood up and said, you don't understand what we're talking about. A jury that knows nothing about structural engineering or architecture or public planning or government, they're going to make the decision on whether you're responsible or not. So I can't deny that. That's the jury system. A jury will decide. So in any event, whatever happens, you have to do something that is reasonable, that is responsible, because somebody's going to find out about it and they're going to ask you what you did. Could be your kids. That famous, quote from the movies, Daddy, what did you do during the war? Know that one? Okay. Now there's formal publications like the governor's report after the Northridge earthquake and the LA Times reports. They did a 4-day series on welded steel moment frames. So if you're an owner and people start showing you this, you can say, I didn't read it, I didn't know about it, and you'll have to say that for 20 years of publications. Good luck. We've actually tallied all the public notice mainstream media articles. This is just one page of them. How much do you need to be found liable? Answer, whenever a jury says, I've seen enough. Okay? Government Code Section 8875 is the one that I was talking about. Owners have been notified that a governmental entity has identified their building as a hazardous building, and the owners have to assess the earthquake response and damage. And this is a formal notice. So in the Mastagni case, the Myrick versus Mastagni case, we were able to introduce the ordinances sent by the city of Paso Robles in the state of California to the owners. And they said, well, yeah, we got these. And, we just thought it was something you get in the mail. They actually denied that they had even read it. They got it and they stashed it, apparently. Which, by the way, for a jury is the wrong thing to say. So this is that famous case now. Statutory compliance is a minimum standard. The Myrick versus Mastagni case, reported in 185 Calap 4th, 1082. The basic rule for an owner is you have to use ordinary care. Then the next test is, did you act as a reasonable owner, as a reasonable person? And does the 2018 compliance test or compliance date give you a hall pass if you have not repaired your structure by that time? And the answer, of course, is no, it doesn't. So if the defense is that an owner has until 2018 to perform a retrofit for earthquake, the Court of Appeal says, look, these governmental building codes are enacted to identify buildings that are potentially hazard and to correct them before there's unnecessary loss of life or injury. So the idea here is to prevent damage and death before it occurs. That is the purpose that the Court of Appeal identified for the California legislature by reading hundreds of pages of legislative hearings, which we attached and argued. And Judge Gilbert writes, the overriding policy behind seismic retrofit ordinance is not to promote the interest of building owners. Instead, the overriding policy is public safety. The purpose of this chapter is to promote public safety and welfare by reducing the risk of death or injury that may result from the effects of earthquakes on existing unreinforced masonry-bearing walls. So there it is. This is what the court relied on in establishing liability against the owner for the death and injuries that occurred during the San Simeon earthquake in 2003. Okay. So we got to read this jury instruction to the jury in San Simeon, and my co-counsel was Rick Friedman out of Washington, very, very famous lawyer, more famous than I am, by the way, but very successful guy, tries cases all over the United States, and he was shocked that this is a California jury instruction that we're allowed to read. Before giving possession of leased property to a tenant, a landlord must conduct a reasonable inspection of the property for unsafe conditions and correct any such conditions discovered in that process. The inspection must include common areas. Then after the tenant has taken possession, a landlord must use reasonable care to correct any unsafe conditions under the landlord's control if the landlord knows or reasonably should have known about those conditions. So what happens when a jury gets this instruction with a notice from the government 18 years earlier saying you have a hazardous building? So even though the San Simeon earthquake and Paso Robles tried in San Luis Obispo is a very conservative, we called it a vicinage, but call it a jurisdiction, very, very conservative jurisdiction. You know, by by educating the jury with simple rules and regulations, where they were teachers or prison guards, we had those on our jury. You know, do you follow the rules? Is it important? Why is it important? That kind of thing. They're looking at a set of rules that are designed for somebody to act, not to ignore things. So the result of that was there was a verdict against the owner for negligence. And one of the best things that happened is I was at an insurance seminar I was giving a couple of years later, and I was informed to my surprise by the insurance industry that after that verdict, no insurance companies would insure URM structures in the Central Coast. They just yanked all their insurance coverage. So now, somewhere in the range of 90% of the URMs on the Central Coast have been reinforced. So you can say that the case was the trigger, but the government has been trying to do this for decades. But apparently somebody has to suffer this kind of a loss for that to happen. In any event, I was pleased by that, and I did get a citation for that. So welded steel moment frames also have a mandatory inspection, and there's a couple of reported cases, Oakland Heritage versus Alliance versus the City of Oakland, which is probably the most interesting case I've read in a decade. It simply stands for the proposition that you could design a structure, a complex, that was going to have a performance standard. We've all heard of that. My favorite one is the farmer, you know, in the Midwest says, hey, I want you to build me a silo that'll hold 250,000 bushels of wheat, and it collapses. And the court says, hey, we don't need to know anything else. It collapsed, you know, guilty. So in this Oakland case, they actually had a Mercalli performance standard. This building has to withstand a Mercalli damage level of Mercalli 10 to Mercalli 12, which is really quite significant. Anyway, it went up to the Court of Appeal. They hemmed and hawed with it, went up for review of the California Supreme Court. Bottom line was it was sent back to the trial court with a simple question: did this building meet code? So all this stuff about Mercalli was thrown out, the performance standard, because a court decided, hey, if it meets code, that's good enough. The reality is code is minimum standard. If the parties negotiate for something higher, then that should be enforced. But I'm not saying it's a bad decision, I just say they missed the mark. But it's the only case I've seen in California where two parties have actually negotiated to have a standard. And you can have any engineer in the state say, this met Mercalli 10 or didn't meet Mercalli 10, then that would impose liability. So I'm going to close now, but I want to remind you that a lot of the people you're going to hear today can enact governmental policy. They're interested in keeping the buildings well and alive. Those are significant aspects of what we do. But in reality, we try one case at a time, in front of one jury and one judge, and we go on appeal very frequently on some of these significant issues. So that's another track that's being taken. But there should be a concern in the industry that if the governmental entities, insurance companies, all those infrastructure institutions do nothing, it's going to come down to us, the trial lawyers. We go to trial every day. Thank you.
Please, if you could.
Sure.
Yes. We have had several questions
Sure.
from our online visitors that I want to share with you. The first question, as you referred to the SB 547, when in the late 80s, the state asked all the cities to identify their unreinforced masonry buildings. As we know, that has had positive outcome. We had quite a few cities actually went, not just identified the buildings, but actually enacted ordinances and either retrofitted them or demolished the buildings. And very few cases, but mostly got retrofitted. Some of the rough estimates that I hear in the industry is about 80% of all the 40,000 buildings were upgraded. Now, there are a few cities that enacted mandatory ordinances. And there are a few cities that enacted voluntary ordinances with requirement to have labels put up front at the entrance that this is the unreinforced masonry building, you're entering this at your own risk, giving notice to the people that are actually walking. So the question that we have is, what is the liability for the government, for the cities that are either had the mandatory ordinances but never enforced their own ordinances, which required the mandatory, or the ones that did the voluntary, basically had knowledge of what these buildings can do?
A very good question, because you're talking about something involving liability for a municipality. So the standard rule that you've heard many times is governmental immunity. In England, you couldn't sue the king. It was called sovereign immunity. In America, it's called governmental immunity. So is that a solid rule? Is that a solid wall? Sure, but you can go around it, just like the German army did in France. That an impenetrable Maginot line. No one could penetrate it, so they went around it. How do you do that? By showing it's a dangerous condition. A city, a municipality is responsible for a dangerous condition. You have to give notice. Everybody's seen the stop sign covered by a tree. The tree controls the street, the city controls the tree. They should trim it, they don't. Somebody has a head-on collision, somebody gets killed, and they sue the city. There's liability in those instances. I think of more significance, these rules that Ali is mentioning, starting with SB 547, are used by me and by other lawyers as standards of care. So in law, that means, when I tell my kids, I guess this is the problem with having kids of a lawyer, I said, that guy did something really bad. And they'll say, like what, Dad? Give me 10 examples. How do you know? That sounds like a really good idea. How do you know? What's the basis for that? They'll ask me that kind of question. Standard of care means the government has set a yardstick. You have a URM building. It is a hazardous building. You have to retrofit it. Remember, all of that is said. The only thing that the cities negotiated for was to extend time. That's all they did, and they got that successfully. But the rest is still valid. We got to read it to the jury. It's a hazardous building. It will kill people. It may collapse. All of that gets in, and the only thing they got to argue was, hey, we had an extension. And Justice Gilbert called that, at the oral hearing, at the Court of Appeal, he called that Russian roulette. You know, the defense was, hey, this building has been up since the 1890s and it hasn't collapsed. And then the judge said, Russian roulette. You know, we're not going to give you a hall pass because you played Russian roulette, and everyone else like you that's doing that is equally playing Russian roulette. So the government, we actually sued the city of San Luis Obispo, their building department, for failing to enforce that ordinance, for not standing up and saying you can't give yet another extension. I think they got 7 extensions. And that part of the case was dismissed. We lost that part of the case on governmental immunity, and we had it up for appeal, but because we had won the underlying case, we decided just to go with the owner. But we're pretty convinced we could have won on a dangerous condition and failing to enforce a known county regulation to abate that dangerous condition. So has that answered your question?
Yes. The difference between if the city has an ordinance, a mandatory and or a voluntary, can you just elaborate
Sure.
a little bit on that?
A voluntary ordinance sounds like this. You have a dangerous building that may harm people. We just wanted to tell you, and we wanted to publish it so the whole world knows about it. Okay, that's pretty significant. Mandatory retrofit is you have a dangerous building, it's going to kill somebody, but we're not going to let it get there. We want you to fix it now. And then they give you a reasonable time frame to fix it. In fact, at the EERI seminar, somebody said, what if the owner said, okay, you got me, I'm fixing it. You know, and in the 3rd month of a 4-month repair, it collapses and kills somebody. Is there a liability? Answer, probably not. Because the jury will say, hey, this guy obeyed the rules, he started the repair, he's 3 months into a 4-month repair, probably okay. He's going to be considered to act reasonably. So that's the kind of analysis you need to do mentally on what is rational and reasonable to do, because you're not going to be doing it. A jury's going to be doing it.
So, Joel, if he did it promptly, I could support that kind of thought.
Right.
But if he has been delinquent,
10 years delinquent, in our case.
isn't that arguable as a revenues act in good faith?
Right. One of the key pieces of evidence in the Myrick versus Mustagny case was that during that 10-year interim where there was extensions, they used $250,000 to put in an elevator set. It's just a 2-story building to get to the 2nd floor so they could lease it for people that were handicapped or the elderly. A good idea. But originally their claim in trial was we didn't have the money. And a jury can consider that. Well, now we showed that they had the money because the seismic retrofit would have cost $195,000. They spent $250,000 on an elevator. So the jury gets to hear that. So, negligence is a dirty game. Negligence is the Chicago Bears, fighting the Dallas Cowboys at, minus 10 degrees, with 2 yards in a cloud of dust. Everything comes in. You know what they got into evidence? Me going into deposition in an unreinforced masonry building to take their depositions. They insisted that I had to take the depositions in this building, and they showed the jury that Joel Castro went into a URM. And I finally figured out why they insisted I go there. But the jury didn't buy that. They knew what was up.
Mr. Castro, we have one more question.
Sure.
I know your time is limited and we want to be respectful to
Sure.
your commitment. But the question is the fact that as you demonstrated in your presentation that the public, the property owners have been noticed time after time, and you can prove that to a jury that most property owners already know if a building is a soft story building or if it's an unreinforced masonry or a concrete frame non-ductile building and so on. And they know the deficiencies, and we know many financing companies and insurance companies require certain studies. There is the one study that is done, a PML.
Right. Probable maximum loss.
Right. And the question is that these PMLs, they always work out. Apparently, it's a requirement that a certain percentage, if it's more than a certain percentage of loss, the loan wouldn't work, but it always usually comes in below that number. There isn't any, according to this consultant is that they have not seen one that actually comes. So what do you think about that?
There's a cottage industry on PMLs, very much like home inspections, which you get what you buy. I really have yet to see a good homeowner inspection where they remove finishes and they actually look for actual defects. Mostly it's all visual. So we don't pay a lot of attention to them, and neither does the jury. They pay a lot more attention to the guys that go photograph areas that are collapsed or do the DT the way we did on Northridge Meadows, or actually do some kind of invasive inspection and tell you what's wrong with the building. But this is this end of the branch here that I'm talking about. Here's the trunk. The trunk that we operate on a daily basis is not out here. It's on the notice by the government that you're the owner of a hazardous building. No amount of PML can get rid of that. It just doesn't happen. If somebody's going to write a PML and says, well, you know, this is an unreinforced masonry building, it's probably going to collapse, but I've worked out the pencils, and I've penciled out the numbers, and it looks good to go. I mean, if you're an owner and you buy that, then you need to rethink your assessment of the PML. The PML should actually put in the cost of the retrofit, the time that it's going to take, and the risks from death, damage, and downtime. Where are those factors? You know, the Stanford guys are involved with that right now, Greg Dearland, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about that after I complete my presentation, but think about that. As an owner, how are you going to deal with deaths, damage, and downtime? That's the real analysis when somebody looks at a PML. Where is that? So it should have that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castro. Let's give Mr. Castro a round of applause. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.